The New York Football Giants have a big training camp ahead, but what expectations can we set for them going into the season? Pro Football Focus, one of the old take it with a grain of salt sources we like to refer to, provides a template and a baseline that brings up maybe more questions than answers, not only for the New York Football Giants, but a lot of teams around the NFL. We dive in right after the theme music. Ah, yes, friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, also covering the Brooklyn Nets on the Locked On Nets podcast with my boy, Doug Norrie. And over there, the seasoned generational ticket holder for the New York Football Giants, healthy, wealthy, and wise, Mr. Andrew Makowitz.
What a weekend. It feels like I need a break from the weekend that we just had. Like having 4th of July on a Monday ends up throwing off the whole schedule, Adam. But it was great. I have one question for you. What was the best thing that you ate over the course of the entire holiday weekend?
Oh, you know what? We took a whole chicken, split it down the middle. You go ahead and open that bad boy up. You drop it onto the grill, which is some salt and pepper, a little lemon seasoning on there, and just let that thing grill up for about an hour. Some corn, very, just very, very relaxed kind of late Monday dinner after you do all the fun stuffs on the weekend, right? Monday, that to your point, it is 4th of July, but that was kind of a nice relaxation, little poolside, delicious chicken coming off the grill.
Oh, I love it. That's a unique one. I was just gonna go with a staple that most Giant fans, especially people in New Jersey, like. A good Thuman's hot dog on a hot day, 4th of July is really where it's at. Needless to say, I had a few of them over the course of the weekend. Very, very happy with myself on that.
Not even going to get into the fact that you eat Thuman's hot dogs. I just listen. There's some questions I'd like to ask there,
Wait,
but
you don't you're not a Thuman's guy?
listen. I happen to be. You go to your local butcher, you get yourself some nice brats, you get some really quality meats on there, and then
Wow.
by the way, I'm probably even going to go with like boar's head makes a really nice dog for you if you want to get in there. None of those nitrates, but this I understand. I'm talking bougie right now, and nobody wants to hear that because the one thing we'd like to be able to talk bougie about is the New York Football Giants. Unfortunately, as we've said before and mentioned at the top, PFF is not the gold standard of what teams are, where players rank, etc. However, like so many other sources, they do provide some insights and certainly some possible benchmarks for where we think the New York Football Giants and the league at large is going to stand. They came out, Andy, and you were the one who brought this article to my attention, and they ranked all 32 NFL teams, highlighting what their biggest strength is, their greatest weakness, and what the X factor will be coming into the season. When we take a look at this list and we go ahead and try to scroll our way down to the New York Football Giants, where do we find them setting up here as we dive in?
Well, as you start scrolling, you scroll down past the Philadelphia Eagles at 7, Adam. Then you
Sure.
continue to go and you're like, oh, surely the Giants are here. And then next up is the Dallas Cowboys
Mhm.
at number 16. You're like, oh, we must be right there. And actually, it's the Washington football team, the Washington Commanders at
You got there. Yeah.
17. And then so you keep scrolling, you're wondering, okay, like, wait, did I miss something? I just saw the Jets. And wait, I just saw the Lions
Mhm.
and I still haven't seen the Giants. The Giants were actually 26th on the list in terms of strengths, weaknesses, top talent on the field. Adam, where does 26 strike you when I say that to you, just as an initial reaction?
I I mean, low, I would say, right? And we're going to get into what they list as the Giants' strength, weakness, and then the biggest X factor for them. It feels low because you and I talk about this team all the time. We covered the draft, right? We feel like the turnover in the regime, Joe Shane, the coaching staff, right? So we have all of this at our disposal to say we've been in the nooks and crannies. There's no way that this team could come out of this year being the 26th overall team by combined metrics of any kind. It's impossible. Maybe mostly because we might end up shutting down the podcast and just abandoning all hope if that were the case, right? But like it feels low. And yet, as we'll go into first, the tenets they mention around strengths and weaknesses here for the Giants, I think we're going to have a conversation here that paints a potentially optimistic picture for the season, but understanding the baseline having the Giants be somewhere in the 20s, I don't think that's as, crazy as Giants fans may feel, at least coming into the year, because there's a lot of go out and prove it for this team on both sides of the ball and on the coaching staff.
Yeah, the initial reaction for me was pretty similar, where you kind of look at the Giants, you say, "Wait, 26 is far too low," and you probably do what every other fan does, that when they start scrolling, you try to find the false negative of another team that's
Sure.
in front of them that you're like, "Absolutely not. This invalidates the entire list. I can't even look at it." And when you see the Lions at 25, you immediately think to yourself, "Man, like this list has to be invalid if the Lions are in front of the Giants." But the first thing that came to my mind, Adam, when we talk about this overall, is the offensive line for the Detroit Lions is one of their strengths. It is a top three offensive line potentially in the league because they
Yeah.
built it through the draft. And that got me thinking, and this is the overall holistic thing, and then we're going to get into it. We'll go to the positives in a second. The negative piece of it is I saw where Dallas was. You see where the Washington is. You see where the Eagles are. And I thought to myself, man, the Giants should be closer to them than they are. But when you think about, just take the Washington, for example. Do the Giants have a wide receiver on their team that you would take over Terry McLaurin?
No, 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 no,
Do the Giants have a defensive player that has shown more than the Cowboys' Micah Parsons in his 1 year?
no.
And so when you start thinking about like what top end talent looks like at each of these positions,
Yeah.
the Giants don't have top three players at any real given position. They may have good groupings of players where collectively you're like, oh, that's a nice compliment. But really, when we're talking about high end talent, like that's where Pro Football Focus starts to move these teams up the list, and it starts with the quarterback in terms of where the Giants sit in this pecking order, right?
Yeah, I think so. And it's a good way to approach it and we're going to get to X factors here, right? And I think some X factors, like with Dallas or like with the Commanders or any of these teams on the list, some X factors are more known commodities than others, right? And we'll discuss what the Giants have on their roster potentially, but that's usually that's kind of what it comes down to, right? And I think it's fair to say when you draft in young talent like the Giants did this year, we think that they're going to be there, but you can't anoint them, right? You can't put the crown on a player before they've actually done it on the field, even if all of the hype and all the speculation and all the film and everything about it says, no, these guys are going to be good and this team is going to improve. You can't jump to a conclusion before it's officially happened. So when we talk about biggest strengths for the New York Football Giants, walk us through what PFF has them down for coming into this season. And again, strengths are a fascinating thing for the Giants because some of it, and we've talked about this before, like even the strengths are, yes, if you confirm their strengths, like that's where I end up being a lot of times.
Yeah, so Pro Football Focus said the Giants' biggest strength is the defensive line, and they kind of throw, even though the Giants, play a 3-4 scheme, they kind of throw the edge rushers, outside linebackers into
Sure.
that fold,
When you're looking
which
for a strength and you want to go defensive line, you know what? Just add in a couple extra guys if we're
yeah,
just
they
trying to make
they
it close.
kind of like circled it a little bit differently than the Giants would when they're talking about scheme, but they basically went in and said Kayvon Thibodeau being an addition on the defensive front to pair with Leonard Williams, Dexter Lawrence, and Azeez Ojulari on the other side, getting double-digit sacks,
Hmm.
makes that Giants defensive line, defensive front really look nice to them. And so the first question I had, Adam, is do you feel like, I mean, they kind of picked their own circle of like how to carve out
Sure.
a grouping, but would you say that this is the far and away the Giants' biggest strength?
Yeah, if you want to say pass rusher, right? Like let's put it that way because that's what they're clumping these guys together. And I think when you're in a 3-4, you kind of do have to extend it out a little bit because looking at just the down technique across the front there, you're going to be a little bit microscopic, and you could be talking about a nose tackle who, as we always say around the NFL in general, you know, their value goes beyond the stat line. So, yes, I do. And interestingly enough, while we're going to get into the defensive side of the ball and the secondary as well in this conversation, I will say, like we've talked about this for years. Giants fans have as well. NFL pundits have as well. The Giants have had a terrible offensive line and they've had a bad defensive front in terms of being able to get after the quarterback. So while the balance has shifted across their sheet here a little bit, this being their greatest strength, arguably, is a big step in the right direction for this team overall because you need to build it up front in the quote unquote trenches. And again, we're getting to the outside edge rushers as well. But but you do need to have that. And the Giants, for so many years, were trying to reverse engineer this thing, right? Even in getting some valuable players in the secondary or getting talented weapons on the offensive side, you kept overlooking the biggest factors. So, yes, it is their greatest strength. Now, relative to what the team is overall and where this line or this unit would stack up in the league overall, that could be a deeper conversation. But I think the talent is there, the skill sets are there, and the complementary skill sets are there, by the way, too, which is something that I think Leonard Williams and Dexter Lawrence are going to benefit greatly from with Azeez Ojulari in his second year, and now the skill set we think that Thibodeau is going to bring.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about this discussion is that the Giants haven't had a legitimate bona fide pass rush in years, right? Like
Yeah, right.
we've had decent players, but we've had Marcus Goldens and others come in and get us a handful of sacks here or there, but we really haven't had a dominant line since dare I say the Super Bowl teams with guys like Strahan and Osi Umenyiora and Tuck
Justin
and
Tuck, and yeah,
Matthias Kiwanuka, all
yeah,
those
yeah.
guys that were complimenting in there where they're like, man, the Giants can really get after the quarterback. And what they say about the upset against the Patriots in the Super Bowl, like Tom Brady just couldn't handle the constant pressure in his face. And so this gives me promise to think that this group that they've put together has the ability to stay together for multiple years. This isn't, oh, one guy's going to turn 36 and he's at the end of his journey. This compilation that the Giants have put together with Thibodeau and Ojulari, coupled in with Williams being under contract for a couple more years, this is a good strength to have. Getting after the quarterback and getting young, athletic pass rushers, they don't grow on trees. So for me, I feel really good seeing this as a Giant strength because this is one of the few areas, obviously outside of quarterback, where you say, if I can get this right, I can build around this team and we could get towards making the playoffs and being competitive for a championship.
Yeah, and even a guy like Dexter Lawrence, again, knowing that in the upcoming offseason, you're certainly going to have some flexibility from a financial standpoint. You may not always think about committing money to that, but as we say, if this unit looks strong together, to your point, hey, like we can keep this thing together for a couple of years with consistency and then start to roll in some replacements as we move down the line. But we've mentioned that, of course, over this offseason. Leonard Williams, well, with his age, would you bring him back? Because he's still in the sweet spot. You can get through this contract and still stick around for a little bit. And I think it's all relative. Like you mentioned some of the older Giants teams and a Michael Strahan. Now, Michael Strahan was at the top of his game, consistently for his entire career, essentially. So keeping him around at the back end and winning a Super Bowl with him, that's different than what Leonard Williams is. But Leonard Williams, if he can step into this role and can benefit from some of this other young talent around him, he can become that veteran stalwart on this defensive unit and maybe become a bit of a leader for them, right? We think the future is going to be Thibodeau, but Leonard Williams has been there. Now, again, maybe we're saying there's always been a little bit of untapped potential there, it feels like, from what he brings to the table as a skill set. But it'll be fascinating, man. That's a really, if you want to paint a bright spot or a bright picture going forward here, is that these handful of players, and then whatever happens over the next couple of seasons, can really be a strength for this team. When we flip it over to the defense, the weakness then for this team, though, what does PFF lay out as being the reason why big contributor to them being 26th?
Well, so immediately for the last 5 to 7 years, you've had to think that the biggest weakness would almost just say offensive line,
For sure.
period, end of statement, and then you'd move on. The Giants have actually moved up in making the moves for signing Glowinski, drafting Evan Neal, already spending a first round pick on Andrew Thomas. To the Giants have a second their second half ranked offensive line in the league, so they're not the glaring weakness they once were, even though there's still some question marks.
Yeah.
Right now, Pro Football Focus says the once deep secondary has thinned considerably over the past year, and they talk about Jabril Peppers leaving. They
Mm-hmm.
talk about James Bradbury not being there anymore.
Logan
There's
Ryan.
Logan Ryan got outright released for literally a handful of dollars of savings, and all of a sudden that once the depth piece that the Giants had in the secondary where they can move all these pieces around now feels like it's relatively thin.
Yeah, and it's funny too, but I'll refer back to what they said with the strength. So it's funny that they go on the same side of the ball, which I think is the classic. We got this really strong. Well, except for the fact that then behind them, But and when we've talked about the linebackers this offseason. We've talked about the secondary, what's going to happen. Aaron Robinson doesn't come in with a glowing PFF grade, or and I think the bigger piece is like a track record, right? Same thing with a guy like Darnay Holmes, same thing with a guy like Julian Love, right? And then you have this collection of rookies that they've also introduced into it with Flott, with Belton, and then inside the linebacking core. So I think there's a lot of questions around what can happen behind that defensive front. But I, we spent so many years, even in the years when we had the Bradberries and we had the Logan Ryans and we had the Jabril Peppers, we still ended up coming back to the fact that, yeah, but secondaries, it doesn't matter how good you are if you don't have the talent up front to force the quarterback to move off his spot, to make him get rid of the ball quicker than he wants to get pressure on him, to shut down the run even, and then put yourself as a defense in the best position to be able to get downhill, attack, and hopefully cause some disruption. So in that sense, yes, it's gotten weaker, at least on paper, but the unit overall might be stronger going forward, right? And to say nothing, by the way, I know it has gotten weaker, but we do expect Adoree Jackson to be, he's right in the prime of his career right now. So I think there still is some value at key positions, including Xavier McKinney as well. So there's a bit of like this weird scale that's shifting very dynamically and understandably in the secondary. Some of these questions I think are going to turn out to be incredible positives, to say nothing of some of the young players like a Dane Belton that we think is poised to have a really big impact in his rookie campaign.
Yeah, they go on to say, which ho hum, Adam, give yourself a pat on the back. Rookie safety Dane
Thank you.
Belton also will have an opportunity to earn a starting job in a thin group. So they've come out and already said, like, they think Dane Belton has a chance to start. They must have been listening to our show because we clearly feel the same way that they do.
There we
But
go.
to your point, it is a little Jekyll and Hyde when we talk about the secondary, because we talk about how thin it is. But then at the top, you mentioned we have Adoree Jackson, who in press man coverage seems to be a is he a top 10 outside cornerback in press coverage? I would say that he probably is at his age. You look at Xavier McKinney
Right.
being, a safety back there. I think that he's a top 5 to 7 safety in the league. So they do have some high end talent, but to that end, after releasing some of the veterans that you have, it does get thin with unproven guys, or back half of the draft selections that still have yet to solidify a starting role in the secondary. So it's a little bit of both, right, Adam?
Yeah, and again, we've said that. I'm gonna keep reiterating it. It's like there is reasons to be excited and question mark. Like there's question marks what they can be, and if it goes right, if 70% of the questions get checked green box yes, well then the Giants can have a dynamic defense. They can be more exciting. We can be progressing in the right direction under Wink Martindale, right? If 70% of them get checked even with question marks, like for example, a Julian Love, right? Or an Adoree Jackson. Is he still where you need him to be? Is Aaron Robinson step up a little bit? Does he provide some security there across from Adoree Jackson? Like, depending on how those boxes go, it doesn't mean that the Giants season need be a disaster or that the defense be a bottom half defense, but we can we won't know how solid of a year this team can have and where they deserve to be ranked until we get some proof, training camp, preseason, and getting into the regular season. So, like, I get the curiosities around this, or I get why they list like some cause for, hey, here's a couple of little bits of optimism, but ultimately, I'll ask you before we get into the X factors, like, how could you make a bold prediction around what this defense will be before you officially see it get onto the field? I think most teams in and around them, like you mentioned, Detroit Lions just ahead of them. Well, guess what? Like, they had this little bit of an upswing last year, not about wins and losses, but the general sense around that team was they drafted well, they brought in good players, and then you got a nice sample size. The Giants are now entering that year. We think they drafted well, brought in some nice pieces. Now go prove it.
A broad, an outside 10,000-foot view, you'd have tons of questions because the Giants don't even know who's going to be starting there right
Right.
now, which is a big concern. But what I will say is the good news is when you double click in and you get into the Giants and the roster and their philosophy and their scheme, knowing that at least it's under Wink Martindale and how the way that the roster is constructed, he wants to get pressure, having that offensive front defensive line be our strength kind of helps the fact that the secondary has the big question marks. So in terms of How would you like this roster constructed if you could flip it and have the defensive line be the problem, but the deep secondary be really good? I don't know if that really would be beneficial or better for the Giants. So, for me, I think the
Yeah.
strength and the weakness is actually where the Giants would ultimately want to be if they had to pick a weakness.
Yeah, you got to. Yeah, yes. We want the offensive line to be good or moving in the right direction. We want the defensive front to be dynamic and capable of getting after the quarterback. And then, yes, what you really want is young talent on both sides of the ball. So then it's like the weapons. Well, you hope you have some dynamic playmakers offensively, and you hope you have some dynamic playmakers in the secondary that can create a little bit of chaos and hopefully, again, create some opportunities for turnovers, make some impact plays. And I think that that's going to be the template going into this year is let's play smart. Let's be aggressive. Let's get downhill. And when opportunities come up, if we capitalize, then we put ourselves in a position to be in ball games and get some wins. If we don't, hey, we may lose some. And that doesn't need to be a referendum on any of these players. But that I think is where this team is headed, at least coming into the season to start. And on that note around dynamic playmakers, when we look in then at the X factors that they put out there, Kadarius Toney, wouldn't you know it? As the first line says, wide receiver Kadarius Toney has had an eventful first year plus in the NFL, including being the center of trade rumors earlier this offseason that have since died down. That obviously is a big factor here when we talk about the New York Football Giants and what they can do on the offensive side of the ball. Because if Kadarius Toney is locked in, and he is the dynamic playmaker that we got a couple of games sample size, real breakout performances for him last season, then all of a sudden everything else plays off of that in a beautiful way. If he's not going to be that guy or not be available due to injury, do you automatically say if Kadarius Toney is not that X factor, then the offense kind of falls down around him? Or do you look at the totality of this unit now and say, no, there's some things that we can work with here?
So to me, it's interesting that they picked the X factor of Kadarius Toney. I think he's more of a question mark. I think he's more of a wild card.
Yeah, I
But
disagree with this. Yeah, I do disagree with this being the X factor.
yeah, to me, it's like yes, Kadarius Toney could or could not have a. I think he's the biggest question mark for in terms of like is the talent going to show on the field. To me, I think how Daniel Jones responds to Mike Kafka and Brian Daboll's system has to be the X factor, right? Like that to me is clear
Well,
as
the X
day.
factor is just Daniel Jones, period. It's just Daniel
Right,
Jones. It's
right.
Daniel Jones is the X factor. He's the quarterback for the Giants. We think we've improved areas. You have playmakers like Daniel Jones. Whatever they ask you to do, if you do it well, then the team will do well. If you struggle, then it doesn't matter what happens on the defensive side of the ball or otherwise, the team is going to struggle.
Right. If put it this way, Adam, if Kadarius Toney for some reason gets injured or isn't available and on the field, like, don't you think Wandale Robinson can give you at least some of the types of plays that Kadarius Toney's going to play? I'm not saying that they're the same player or he's as dynamic, but like
Sure.
the Giants it's not going to make or break like a couple of games for them, having that different swap. If Daniel Jones can't get it done for the Giants, they go from potentially being a 10-win team down to a 4-win team, and like that to me is the
Well,
biggest
maybe
like.
we could debate that a little bit if we want to.
Well, I mean, if he is not the guy and he is struggling, to
Yeah.
me,
Well, you know
like the
what?
variation ends up being very high to very low.
Well, so here's what is interesting because maybe Daniel Jones being the X factor. It's a little fascinating. Like, I don't think that Kadarius Toney is.
Well,
And so
before you
yeah,
finish
go
your
ahead.
thought, what I think. So here is what
Because
I
I'm
will say.
backing off of Daniel Jones being the X
They,
factor, actually.
I believe Pro Football Focus didn't pick Daniel Jones because they already believe they know what Daniel Jones is.
Right,
So
right.
he's not necessarily going to be an X factor. They're like, he is a factor. He is a known commodity. And that's why we have the Giants ranked 26.
Right.
Whereas Kadarius Toney for them is like, man, he's got so many highs. And if he could stay on the field, he could really throw this whole thing for a loop.
Yeah, well, and so that's why I mean, and I know this is like a cop out, but it'd be saying like the offensive line is the X factor, right? Because then you can say, well, even if Daniel Jones is not the franchise quarterback and he gets injured or he gets outright benched, I can still, just to that point before, say, well, I can paint a picture where Tyrod Taylor, veteran quarterback with experience, could step in and be serviceable for this team. If you tell me that the X factor offensive line is playing top 18, 17 offensive line play in the league, right? Be middle, top half of the pack, close to there. Then all of a sudden I can say, oh, well, I can learn about everything else that's going on the offensive side of the ball if that X factor is checked off. Whereas if Kadarius Toney is the X factor and he doesn't show up, to your point, well, I can still learn a lot about a lot of things on this offense with or without Kadarius Toney. Likewise, I can still learn a lot about this team and this offense overall, whether or not Daniel Jones is successful. Like some things, and actually when he's on the field, we can say, oh, I'm learning a lot about other players while learning that Daniel Jones is not going to be the guy, or that he is, right? I'm not putting it on either side of it, but that to me is probably the difference. So I don't even think that Daniel Jones is the X factor in that same sense. So you say maybe PFF says we already know what he is or what he is not. And going forward, it need not be that Daniel Jones is the X factor to have for this team to have success, short or long term.
You're right. And let me finish and
Thank you.
close
We'll
this.
be back next time.
Well, listen, no, I think we're going to close this out on an agreement note, Adam, because at the end of the day,
Well,
I
hold on here, buddy. I
what
want you to agree with me, but I do just want to briefly here, before we get out of this discussion, I do want to ask the question about, are we setting up for disappointment around this conversation? The X factors, where this team ranks. They're 26th overall. And just when you look through this list, do you see when we talk about, well, hey, who's in and around the New York Football Giants? Like again, the Detroit Lions, they have a very strong offensive line. Is Jared Goff the answer for them? Obviously not. And he has a disastrous, by the way, it's why you sometimes take PFF with a grain of salt. He's a 60 PFF grade last year. Daniel Jones is a beautiful 71.6, right? And we also know that Jared Goff has a much stronger track record. You look at some of the other teams in around them behind them with the Carolina Panthers. They have so many question marks, especially at the quarterback position. It just, when you look through this, do you think that given all the teams around them, are the Giants capable of moving up this list in somewhat quick order as the season gets underway? Or when you get into those top 20 teams, those top 15 teams, when we see the Indianapolis Colts are middle of the pack to start this year right now, based on PFF, do you go, okay, we can get better, but we also do need to set a reasonable ceiling of expectations?
Yeah, so that I go to the latter piece of it where you just brought up. It's like, I'm excited about what the Giants can be. I think the Giants need a lot of things to go right to be a middle top, 15th ranked team in this entire thing, because to
Right.
your point, you have the Colts, you have the Cowboys, you have the, Washington Commanders are all sitting right around that 15, 16, 17 piece of it, and the Giants are far enough away from them to be realistic and say the Giants need a lot of things to be able to move up the list considerably. And yes, I think we need to understand Vegas is telling us that the Giants are good for 7 wins. Pro Football Focus and other metrics are saying the Giants are 26th, 27th in talent across the board because they don't have top 1, 2, 3 talent at any of these positions. I think we need to be realistic with, we want to see progression. It may not be in terms of wins and losses. It may just be more competitive across the board. But yeah, it's tough. I think the Giants can surprise people, but right now I think they're being accurately portrayed because they have given no one any reason to do otherwise.
And by the way, when we talk about the playoff picture and the extra slot to get in there, being top 15, 16, 17 means you're in the mix for potentially a playoff berth, which is where we'd at least like to see the Giants sniff around. I will say, man, when you see the Raiders at 21
I
and
know.
you see the Steelers at 22, like I'm running through this, the Arizona Cardinals at 23, and then hitting the New York Jets at 24, as you said, before we get to the Lions and the Giants, like, uh, good conversation. Good to talk about the Giants in areas that we think that we have some interesting narratives developing. And also, sometimes when you look at this list or any list, by the way, you go, all right, like I do have some questions around the way that they compile this from a talent standpoint, a ranking standpoint, and an expectation standpoint, Andy, at the end of the day.
Well, so at the end of the day, what I was going to say, Adam, is I agree with you. You've changed my mind on the X factor piece. I do believe you're 100% right. It is the offensive line because it impacts every other group that we have a question mark about.
Yep.
We didn't even mention Saquon Barkley. Like, if the offensive line does what it needs to do, are we going to see a revitalized, a refreshed, Saquon Barkley on a mission? Everyone keeps talking about year 2 after coming off of a knee injury is
Yep.
really where
Yep.
you start to see the burst come back. We get none of these answers on Saquon Barkley, on Daniel Jones, or otherwise if the offensive line doesn't perform at least up to what we hope they are going to be, which is a middle of the road offensive line in this league.
100%, man. We've talked about it for years. We know that. And then inside of this conversation, if we think this defensive front is going to be a strength, then hopefully some of the younger talent can develop and have an opportunity to be as effective as possible while moving that learning curve over the start of the season on the defensive side. And then offensively, it all plays off of that. And by the way, whether it's Daniel Bellinger, who obviously Andy has been very high on since he got into camp and started hearing all the positive remarks, whether it is Wan'Dale Robinson, who I immediately said, listen, went back, checked the tape, looked at all of those possible measurables. I think this kid is poised to be a really big piece for the Giants. All of those guys, we've already done it once where the Giants' ineptitude as an organization has potentially wasted the talent of a Saquon Barkley, regardless of how we think about where he was drafted. Let's not do it again, right? So that offensive line being successful and being something that they can depend on is going to dictate how the young talent develops on the offensive side of the ball and proving some pieces around Daniel Jones or a Saquon Barkley. Guess what, guys? We've got more great conversations coming in here as we work our way towards training camp. You get us on YouTube, you get us on the podcast feed. You're going to have seen, if not already by now, in the next moments, you're going to start to see the YouTube feed and the podcast feed really get dumped with a lot of great content. We had some technical glitches leading into the holidays. So we had some great discussions that we want to get out there for you. Get ready for all of that. Get in the conversation. And of course, we'll be back in talking all things New York Football Giants, as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.